Then a geologist analyzed the soil found on Debbie's clothing and made a finding that fundamentally redirected the investigation. The dirt came from two distinct locations. One matched the dump site. The other matched a specific clay composition from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road, roughly 3 miles away. Debbie was not killed where she was found. She was transported there afterward. Her killer had time. He had a plan. He knew the area well enough to select 2 separate locations. 2 pieces of evidence were recovered near the body. A strand of brown hair. Lab analysis placed it as coming from a white male likely between 18 and 30 years of age. And a small circular piece of cloth with a floral design. Both were logged. Both were carefully preserved. And with 1972 technology, both were silent. Thousands filled the Roswell Street Baptist Church for Debbie's funeral. The congregation overflowed into the street. A city that had spent 16 days searching gathered in a silence so complete it pressed against the walls. Debbie was laid to rest at Kentstone Memorial Park. Her killer went home, closed his door, and carried on with his life, certain the trail had died with her in those trees. He was almost right, but he made one error. He left something behind, and it was waiting for him. The 4 detectives who worked this case in 1972, Lieutenant Bill Hudson, Major Tim Buckley, Captain Bill Elliott, and Lieutenant Ray Owens, were not careless men. They followed hundreds of tips across Marietta and Cobb County. Every lead was checked. Everyone went cold. The composite sketch led nowhere. The dark pickup was never traced. But before they moved on, those detectives did something quiet. Something that would ultimately matter more than anything else they could have done. In 1972, with no database to cross-reference and no science capable of interpreting what they held in their hands, they preserved everything anyway. The strand of hair, the small circular cloth, every piece of physical evidence, sealed carefully inside a box, addressed, without knowing it, to the future. They could not have imagined that what was inside would one day speak louder than any witness. Years moved, then decades. Juanita kept every newspaper article ever printed about her daughter's case. John carried something behind his eyes that never fully left. Melvin grew up, built a life, watched his own hair go gray, and still woke some mornings with the same question pressing against his chest. Who took her? In 2001, a detective named Morris Nix went looking through old cold case files. Nix was not approaching this from a professional distance. He was a lifelong Marietta resident. He had been young when Debbie disappeared, old enough to remember what those 16 days had done to the community, old enough to remember his mother telling him to stay inside, old enough to remember the way adults spoke in lowered voices, and how the neighborhood felt different afterward, as if something had been taken from the air itself. When Nix opened that evidence box, what he felt was not professional curiosity. It was something older, something personal. He sent the preserved hair to the FBI for analysis. A partial DNA profile came back. White male consistent with the original 1972 lab findings. Investigators ran it against every available database. Nothing. The man who killed Debbie had no DNA on record anywhere. A biological description with no name attached. The technology simply hadn't caught up yet. Nix sealed the box again and waited for the world to get there. In March 2015, Cobb County established a dedicated cold case unit. In its first 2 years, the unit resolved 9 cases, 8 arrests, 6 criminal prosecutions. Morris Nix returned. He brought Debbie's file with him. This time, attention moved to the circular cloth. After more than 40 years in storage, the cloth was sent to a forensic laboratory for updated analysis. A partial male profile came back. Investigators submitted it to CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System, containing profiles from convicted offenders across the entire country. If this man had ever been arrested and processed anywhere in America, the system would surface him. The search returned empty. After 43 years of preservation, FBI testing, and a brand new cold case unit, the killer had never placed himself in the system. He had lived his entire life without generating a record serious enough to flag him. Another closed door. The cloth went back into storage. In October 2021, the District Attorney's Office received a Bureau of Justice federal grant allocated specifically for cold case work. That funding unlocked something that had not existed as a viable investigative tool even 5 years prior. Genetic genealogy. The concept works like this. Investigators are no longer searching for the suspect himself. They're searching for his blood. Somewhere out there, a relative of the man who killed Debbie Lynn Randall had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to a public ancestry website to find cousins, to trace family history, with no awareness that a piece of cloth from a 1972 crime scene in Marietta, Georgia, was about to find them. In 2022, the cloth was submitted to DNA Labs International, a Florida-based forensic laboratory. Their task was to build a S&P profile detailed enough to cast a net across millions of publicly available genetic records and pull out any thread, however distant, that connected back to the DNA on that cloth. Somewhere in a database full of ordinary people tracing their ancestry, there was a genetic breadcrumb leading back to a killer, and investigators were going to follow it, one relative at a time, constructing a family tree branch by branch until they arrived at a name. The cloth had sat in the dark for 50 years. It already knew who had put it there. In 2023, it finally told someone. What followed was painstaking work. Genetic genealogy does not deliver a name immediately. What investigators received first was a familial connection, a partial genetic overlap indicating that someone in the database was related to the DNA contributor on that cloth. Not the perpetrator himself. A relative, possibly a distant one who had never heard of Debbie Lynn Randall. From that single thread, investigators began constructing a family tree by hand, branch by branch, generation by generation, cross-referencing public records, census data, and death certificates to map out who was related to whom and how far those relationships extended. The goal was to work inward, trace family lines backward and sideways, narrow down to a specific individual matching the profile established by the original forensic evidence. White male, likely between 18 and 30 years old in 1972, with some connection to the Marietta apartment complex where Debbie Randall lived. The tree kept expanding. The circle kept contracting. And then a name surfaced. William B. Rose. Mableton, Georgia. 24 years old on January 13th, 1972. Investigators ran his name through every available record. And the first thing that stopped them was this. William B. Rose had never been a suspect in this case. Not in 1972. Not in 2001 when the FBI tested the hair. Not in 2015 when the cold case unit reopened the file. Not once in 51 years had his name appeared anywhere in the investigation. He had been completely invisible. His criminal history offered almost nothing. A handful of alcohol-related incidents. No violence on record. No pattern that would have elevated a flag. To every person who knew him, William Rose was simply a young man from Mableton with a drinking problem and a circle of people who saw nothing in him resembling what he actually was. But here is the connection that explained everything. Rose had family members who lived in the same apartment complex as the Randall family. He had been there before, possibly many times. Investigator Ron Alter later noted that children in that complex frequently played outside. Rose had in all likelihood seen Debbie before, probably more than once. He knew the area. He understood the rhythms of the place. And on the evening of January 13th, 1972, when a 9-year-old girl in lavender shoes walked out of a laundromat alone, he saw an opening. Not a scheme. Not a premeditated target. An opening. That is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Debbie was not selected because of who she was. She was in the wrong place at the precise moment a dangerous man happened to be watching. A matter of minutes. A matter of timing. There was one significant problem with formalizing the case. William B. Rose was dead. He had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's killing. He was 26 years old. And according to conversations investigator Ron Alter had with Rose's surviving family, Rose had been visibly frightened in the period leading up to his death, anxious in a way his relatives could not fully explain because they assumed his fear traced back to his minor alcohol incidents. They had no idea what he was actually carrying. Alter's assessment was direct. Rose likely believed investigators were closing in on him. Whether that was grounded in reality or simply paranoia born from guilt, nobody can say with certainty. What is certain is that he chose to end his life before he could be made to answer for what he had done. He almost took the truth with him. Almost. Before any public announcement, investigators needed absolute confirmation. The familial DNA connection was strong. The circumstantial links were compelling. But in a case this old, with a family that had waited this long, compelling was not the standard. Confirmed was, with the full cooperation of Rose's surviving family, people who had no prior knowledge of his involvement and were devastated by what they were learning, his body was exhumed. Direct DNA samples were collected and compared against the profile from the cloth. The match was exact. William B. Rose was Debbie Lynn Randall's killer. Not probably. Not likely. Confirmed. September 18, 2023. Cobb County, Georgia. District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. stood at the podium. He spoke about the incomprehensible weight of losing a child and about a family that had waited through decades for a word that had no adequate substitute. He acknowledged plainly that no answer could replace what had been taken. Then Morris Nix, the lifelong Marietta resident who had carried this case in his chest since boyhood, who had reopened it in 2001, who had refused to set it down through every dead end, stepped forward and said the sentence that will stay with everyone who heard it. Technology does not get old. It doesn't retire. It doesn't get sick. And it doesn't quit. Technology was seeking William Rose, and it found him in the grave. 51 years. One scrap of cloth. One man who believed he had slipped away clean. He had not. But the hardest part of this story is not the science, is not the investigation, is not even the killer. The hardest part is who was absent from that room on September 18th, 2023. Juanita Randall spent her final years battling leukemia. In July 2018, even while ill, she sat for an interview. She talked about Debbie, about the pain that had never eased, about the hope she still carried. Her exact words, she wanted to know who had done it before she passed. She did not get that. Juanita died on September 17th, 2018. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were interred alongside Debbie's body at Kentstone Memorial Park, because even in death, she did not want to be separated from her daughter. The answer came 5 years too late for her. John Randall held on longer. He kept every newspaper clipping. He gave interviews. He kept talking because he kept believing that someone would see it, that someone would come forward, that justice would reach him while he was still present to witness it. John Randall died in January 2022, 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's disappearance. He died not knowing that the cloth was already at a laboratory in Florida, already being analyzed, already pulling threads that led directly to the man who took his daughter. 3 days, 50 years of enduring, and he missed the answer by less than 2 years. There are no words sufficient for that. There is one person who was in that room on September 18th, 2023. Not a detective, not a prosecutor, not a forensic scientist, a grandfather. Melvin Randall stood at that press conference with silver in his hair and a lifetime behind his eyes. He was 10 years old when his sister disappeared. Sick in bed that evening. He had stayed home. And for 50 years, through his teenage years, through raising his own children, through becoming a grandfather, that single fact had never stopped finding him. He was supposed to be there. He was not. And she was gone. When Melvin spoke, he did not speak like a man consumed by grief. He spoke like a man who had done the hard, invisible work of reaching something close to peace with something that never fully deserved it. He spoke about blaming himself for years, about battling with it, and then about the moment he understood there was nothing he could have done. Then he said something that stops you completely. He forgave William B. Rose. Not because what Rose had done was forgivable, not because 51 years had reduced the weight of it, but because Melvin Randall had learned through the long and painful way that carrying that kind of anger only extends the damage. He extended that same grace to Rose's family. The people who had cooperated fully with investigators, who had surrendered their DNA, who had authorized an exhumation, and who had spent their entire lives unaware of what the man they loved had done. Melvin wanted them to know he held no animosity toward them, no hatred. He said he would be praying for them too. A man who lost his sister at 10 years old, praying for the family of the man who took her. There's no script for that kind of grace. But grace cannot restore what was lost. Debbie's death did not leave only absence, however. After her killing in 1972, a woman named Joyce Dunaway Parker looked at what had been inflicted on this community and resolved to build something from the wreckage. She founded the Cobb Marietta Girls Club, a nonprofit created specifically to give the city's young girls a safe space, a place to go, a place to belong. That organization eventually merged into Girls Incorporated, a national network devoted to empowering young women across the country. It exists in part because Debbie Lynn Randall existed, because her death made one woman refuse to let the fear be the final word. October 19th, 2023. 1 month after William Rose was publicly named. Outside the Girls Incorporated building on Main Street in Marietta, just a few blocks from where Debbie was last seen alive, a crowd gathered for a ribbon cutting. The Debbie Lynn Randall Memorial Butterfly Garden was being dedicated. Students from the Marietta Center for Advanced Academics had hand-painted the stones lining the garden. Retired law enforcement were there. Morris Nix was there. District Attorney Brody was there. And Melvin Randall was there. He stood in front of those painted stones, the flowers, and the people who had come to say that his sister mattered. And something in him gave way. He said, "Y'all brought a big man like myself to my knees today." Then they released the butterflies. Scores of them, rising into the Marietta sky, spreading out over the street and the trees of a neighborhood where a 9-year-old girl had once walked to a laundromat in brand new lavender shoes. Melvin watched them go. Debbie Lynn Randall was 9 years old. She loved dolls and baseball and her brother Melvin. She had freckles and a laugh that her family carried for the rest of their lives. She walked out a laundromat on an ordinary Thursday evening in January 1972, and the world took 51 years to answer what happened next. Her parents died waiting. Her brother bore the weight of a sick day for half a century. And the man who took her shoes believed he had taken everything. He had not. Because 51 years later, on a warm October morning in Marietta, Georgia, scores of butterflies rose into the sky in her name. Her killer was in the ground. Her brother was on his knees in gratitude. And Debbie Lynn Randall, the freckle-faced third grader from Pine Forest Elementary, was finally, after all this time, at rest. Justice carries no expiration date. It simply, sometimes, arrives too late for the people who deserve to witness it most. Before you go, do you believe Melvin's decision to forgive was the right one? Or is some grief simply too deep for that? If you were Juanita or John, would you have found a way to carry hope through 50 years of silence? Or would the not knowing have broken you completely? And does justice carry genuine meaning when the person responsible never faced a single day of accountability? Put your thoughts in the comments. In cases like this one, the conversation does not end when the video does. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Vault for more cases like this one. The links and sources are in the description. We will see you in the next one.